Have you ever picked up a novel that was set in a place that was near and dear to your heart, only to start reading it and realize that the author had never even been to your special place? That's happened to me, and I put the novel down and never finished it. But it's that has not happened with Zane Grey's writings because he was very conscientious about being accurate about the places he visited and be telling a story that matched the real landscape and also the people that he encountered on his journeys out west. The Vanishing American is one of his novels that came out in 1925, and it's really exceptional in its level of accuracy in not only the places in the story, but the people and some of the events. Just as a kind of a real brief summary of the romantic part of it, which is not accurate. That's all made up, but it's the drama that's in the story. There was a Nopa boy, which means Navajo, named Nofai, and he was forcibly taken from his reservation, sent to Pennsylvania to attend a government boarding school. He fell in love with a young woman named Marion Warner, and after returning to his homeland, he asked Marion to join him there. The year is 1916. Marion takes a long trip west and is greatly helped in understanding her new environment and reuniting with Nofai by the kind help of Mr. and Mrs. John Withers, the owners of a remote trading post. After numerous conflicts with the local Bureau of Indian Affairs personnel and missionaries, Nofai takes refuge in the secluded canyon of Silent Walls. There's a lot more to the story than this, but these are the points that I'm going to be focusing on to start out with. Zane Grey stated that he claimed fidelity to the beauty and the grandeur of the spirit and wilderness and the history of our West. And so when he writes novels that are historical in nature, it pretty much matches the true history that he had learned about on his trips out west. There are several types of non-fictional elements where Zane Grey uh, used fidelity to the truth in writing the stories. Places such as in this book, The Canyon of Silent Walls, which is his pseudonym for a place called Surprise Valley. People such as Mr. and Mrs. John Withers, who helped Marion, and also Nofai, their pseudonyms for John and Louisa Wetherell, who were my great grandparents. And this idea that real people and places are behind the story in The Vanishing American has been studied quite a bit. One of the foremost scholars who have looked into this, Henry Nardi, a member of the Zane Grey's West Society, has been working on this for a long time, and this is one article he wrote on that story. Another source, if you're interested in pursuing this, the Society's Ed Meyer has put together this web story on the Society website that goes into this exact issue. It's called The Vanishing American, More Than a Western Novel. And on this website, which you can pull up, he lists all these aspects of The Vanishing American, people, places. You can click on any of these links and get some really interesting information on the real people and places behind these names. So I highly recommend that. Another type of non-fictional element in Zane Grey's writing is events, so as, for example, in this book, he tells about the killing of a Navajo or a Nopa man named Doa Tin, instigated by this local Bureau of Indian Affairs boarding school superintendent, and his thugs went up to the home of Do-10 and killed him. Well, that's a real story about a man named Taddy Tin, who was killed in 1916 by representatives of the boarding school superintendent. And there's been a lot of research on that also. Here again is another article by Henry Nardi on the events and real people in the Vanishing American. Henry and I have been working for quite a while on this project, and we've dug up reams of documentation on the real story. Not only the killing of Taddy Tin, but what was going on at the Indian Agency, corrupt missionaries that Zane Grey wrote about, and a lot of other stories. So this is an article that recently came out in the Zane Grey Explorer about Taddy Tin. That's a photo of the murdered man there below and the man who killed him. There's also a presentation I gave at last year's Zane Grey's West Society convention on this subject, and that's on YouTube now. So if you're interested, you can pull that up. Just a little follow-up on the killing of Taddy Tin. Henry and I ran across this article about the killing a few years ago. We didn't know that anybody else was interested in it, and we'd been digging into it in some detail. So Henry contacted the author and found out that some family members, descendants of Taddy Tin, had sponsored this research, Logan and Rita Senegini. And they're very fine folks who want to tell their ancestors' story. So they initiated the article, but we've gotten in touch with them, and we found that we had very much in common to talk about and share. So it's been a very fruitful collaboration project. We're still working with them and benefiting greatly, and I think they're benefiting from our research as well. You might recall that Logan attended last year's society convention, and we were very pleased to have him there. And we're working on follow-up, maybe a documentary coming out and a book. So stay tuned for all of that. And just another follow-up that doesn't really tie into Zane Grey too much, but in the course of this research, we found that Taddy Tin's father, Benny Tin, otherwise known as Hostine Jones, was a very significant historical figure. And we've surprisingly found a lot of information about him, including the fact that he lived in Inscription House Canyon. You can kind of see where this is. This is down here in the southwest corner of the map is Tuba City, and up here is Kayentay. So Inscription House Canyon is here. It includes a cliff dwelling that's part of Navajo National Monument. Anyway, we learned that he had lived there, and we wanted to show the family what that was like down there. So we organized an excursion into the canyon with some family members, and you can see the level of interest in the folks, the Senegines and Taddy Tin descendants. Up behind us is the cliff dwelling of Inscription House here that you can't really see very well, but it was quite a thrilling excursion, and we're talking about going back and trying to find the actual hogan that Hostine Jones lived in. In addition to places, people, and events, another thing we find in his novels that is not fictional is his own moral values that come out. And he makes a point in, I think, quite a few novels of using the story to tell that story. The quintessential book about that is this one written by our dear late Zane Grey West Society member, Chuck Pfeiffer. And it goes into a great deal in analyzing Zane Grey's writings and uh, interpreting what his values were, religious and philosophically. In other words, this is another article written by one of our members, Ed Meyer, that goes into a similar subject on a briefer scale. These articles, by the way, are available on the Zane Grey West Society website. Actually, the journals are available, and you can pull them up and read the articles, and it's a very important resource. Well, going through this, I concluded that there's one more type of non-fictional element, and I'll talk about that a little later, that's very important to me. But moving on, some objectives I want to cover in this talk. Gray's depiction of his fictional Mr. and Mrs. Withers accurately describes the character of my great-grandparents, John and Louisa Wetherill. Gray's depiction of Marion Warner's route to the place where she reunited with Nofai accurately describes the roads, trails, and places that Zane Grey traversed on his 1922 Rainbow Bridge expedition. And Gray's depiction of the Valley of Silent Walls in the novel accurately describes the characteristics of the real place that he called Surprise Valley. Early in the novel, Zane Grey mentions a place, Old Jato, and that's actually a real place. Delphi had sent a letter to Marion, who was living in Philadelphia. He said, "Come, Marion, to Old Jato," wanting her to come out where he was. And that's his traditional sheep herding area when he was a boy. There really is an Old Jato, Utah. Zane Grey interprets this Navajo name as meaning moonlight on the water. It was the location of a trading post that my great-grandparents ran from 1906 to 1910. But by the time this book was written, there were no outsiders living there and no structures that were significant other than the dwellings of the local people. Old Jato is located in very southern Utah, just a few miles north of the Arizona state line and just west of Monument Valley. A very difficult place to get to. So someone like Marion, if she was going to try and get there, she would, coming from Philadelphia, would take the train to Flagstaff, Arizona. And that's what she did in the novel, although Zane Grey changed the name of Flagstaff to Flaggerstown. So she got to Flaggerstown and found out that a mail carrier went up north twice a week, and he would be able to take her in his dilapidated Ford car up to a place called Kaidab. And on the way, they would pass through two towns called Mesa and Red Sandy. So this is all very recognizable, the route from Flagstaff or Flaggerstown up north. Mesa was Zane Grey's pseudonym for Tuba or Tuba City. Red Sandy was Red Lake, and Kaidab was Kayente, where my great-grandparents lived. You can see that here that the end of the route was still south of Old Jato, so that would be another issue of getting up further north. When Marion got to Kaidab, she was quite intrigued. As Grey said, she looked and looked with the mounting delight and wonder. And one of the things she saw, it was a trading post, huge bags of burlap containing wool, which were being packed into a wagon by Indian freighters. The real town of Kayente, where my great-grandparents lived, there was their trading post, and this top photo was taken by Zane Grey in 1913 when he first visited them. You can see the bags of wool and the freight wagon in the photo. And then the second photo is their house, which was adjacent to the trading post. This photo was taken on Zane Grey's 1922 trip to Rainbow Bridge when he was gathering information for the Vanishing American. So immediately on reaching Kaidab, Marion met the proprietor, John Withers, a sturdily built man. Keen-eyed man stalked out of the post. Glad to welcome you, Miss Warner. I'm John Withers. And that, of course, was modeled after my great-grandfather, John Witherell. Mr. Withers took Marion into the house, and she was stunned with what she saw. A wonderful room that seemed to flash Indian color and design at her. Blankets on floor and couch, baskets on mantel and wall, and a strange painted frieze of Indian figures, crude, elemental, striking. And that matches a description of the Wetherells' living room exactly. Grey went on to write that this room opened onto a long dining room with the same ornamental Indian effects. And that's a photo of the actual dining room. I think it's clear that Mr. and Mrs. Withers were closely modeled after the Wetherells. And their environment was also. Marion was in the house just a short time, and she met the hostess of the place, Mrs. Withers, who was very gracious and warmly welcomed her. And that's exactly how my great-grandmother was portrayed by people who encountered her. She went on to say that Marion sensed something of the power she had felt in women of high position. Although in the case of Mrs. Withers, it was a simplicity of power and a strange unconscious dignity, spiritual rather than material. And this is what other people who visited Louisa Wetherell said about her. More on Mrs. Withers. In the novel, Zane Grey discussed her love of the Indians, her knowledge of them, respect, and their love and respect for her. Here she's talking to Marion about that. Well, Zane Grey, on his 1922 trip, he spent a day or two with Louisa Wetherell, and he said her Indian name was Austin Sosi. Those are Navajo words that mean slim woman, so that's what her friends called her. She knew more about the Navajos than any other white person. And that's a photo of her on the bottom. So that kind of covers the first part of what I wanted to achieve, is just to provide convincing evidence how closely the Wetherells modeled the characters in the book, Mr. and Mrs. Withers. And there's a lot more throughout the book about them. It all seems to be consistent with the way Zane Grey would have observed them. I now want to look into Marion's trail ride. She had to go meet Nofai. He wasn't going to come and meet her. And although he had said told her to come to Old Jato, which was up here, and she was down here, he wasn't in Old Jato. He had been staying up at Navajo Mountain herding sheep. And that was a long ways from Kayente, maybe 50 miles on the trail over very rough country. So somehow she had to get up there to rendezvous with him. She asked John Withers if he would take her, and he said he would. This would be a horseback ride of many miles. He says, "I'll take you over the Paiute Trail. You'll be the first white person except myself to ride on it." So kind of an exciting and dangerous route that they took. So the story goes on to tell about starting out on this trip and going by a big black rock that Mr. Withers says is called the Captain. That's actually El Capitan. I'll show you that later. And on up a ways, it was obviously a very new experience for Marion, but they set up camp that night, and she was kind of intrigued seeing how Mr. Withers set up the camp also. Uh, this second paragraph I have highlighted, she was watching him cooking in a Dutch oven, which is something I guess she hadn't seen before. We're fortunate to have this photo of John Wetherell cooking in a Dutch oven that it might have been taken by Zane Grey, or definitely on one of his trips. And it's from Brigham Young University, who has very huge repository of Zane Grey materials. Next day, they started out on the Paiute Trail, and Withers said how dangerous it was. She would have to be walking sometimes because the horse might fall, and they could both get killed. Climb slow, rest often, and keep on the upside of your horse. Zane Grey kind of condensed this part of the trip to one day. So this dangerous Paiute Trail journey took one day, and towards the end of the day, they came to a precipitous cliff that they had to come up. And the painting or sketch kind of shows the way Zane Grey described it. Very precarious. If you fell, you'd definitely be killed. Rocky and hard to keep your footing. But Marion was determined, and they kept going, and they didn't have any mishaps, fortunately. At the top of the cliff, Marion spotted a sole person on a horse, and it was her lover, Nofai. And this is a very dramatic part of the book when she hurries up to see him and the two reunite. So obviously this spot and the terrain is a very important one in the book where the two of them reunited. And as we'll see a little later, it was a real place that we can identify with quite a bit of certainty. So we can actually retrace pretty much the whole route that Zane Grey was writing about, because he had taken that route in 1922 when he went to Rainbow Bridge. This echoes what he said in the book. Wetherell, I said to the trader, I want you to take me across the uplands into Utah as far as Nanazoshi, which is what he called Rainbow Bridge, on a trail never ridden by a white man. Can you do it? Most of the way yet, he replied with a smile. There's the Paiute Trail. So Zane Grey was out for a real adventure on an unused trail. His trip to Rainbow Bridge took place in April of 1922. And he basically rode horses from Flagstaff to Rainbow Bridge and returned. Travel was by horseback about 220 miles each way. And the purpose of the trip was information gathering for the preparation for the writing The Vanishing American. We're very fortunate to have quite a number of photos. There's an album at Utah State University that has more than 400 photos, and there are quite a few more additional ones at BYU. So we can document the route that Zane Grey took by studying those photos, and a lot of other aspects of the trip, the people and so on. The Wetherells kept a guest register in their house, and they asked their visitors to sign in. So this is the page from that 1922 trip. You might have seen it before, with the names of the Zane Grey party. The sketch was made by Lillian Wilhelm Robertson, who of course was the same Lillian Wilhelm who had come to Rainbow Bridge with Zane Grey in 1913, Dolly Grey's cousin. She was so enamored by Arizona that she moved out there out here to live permanently in 1917, settling in Tuba City, where she met a man named Westbrook Robertson, and they got married. And by the way, Lillian and Westbrook were also characters in The Vanishing American. So that's another story. Participants in the trip, of course, Zane Grey. He brought along his brother Romer, R.C. Grey, his cook, George Takahashi, his local guide, who was Lee Doyle from Flagstaff. Lee was the son of Al Doyle, his longtime guide, who had recently died, so Lee took over those duties. And Lillian Wilhelm Robertson. Also along was a 15-year-old girl, Louise Anderson. She was a daughter of some of Zane Grey's friends from Ohio. And then his fishing buddy called the Lone Angler, Dr. J. Auburn Wyborn and Mrs. Wyborn were on the trip. And then there was John Wetherill, my great-grandfather from K&T, and his assistant or guide, Navajo guide, Hosteen Nez. There were 5 other men listed in various registers, and we don't know too much about them other than they were wranglers and helpers, so they didn't have a prominent story. And we can't really correlate the individual men with photos, but they were along as well. So let's look at the map and try and figure out, how did Zane Grey get to Rainbow Bridge in 1922? He would have started in K&T down in the southeast corner of this map, down here, and had to go all the way up to Rainbow Bridge in the northwest corner. We can rule out a couple of options. First of all, there was a southern route that had been taken by a lot of people up till that point, including Zane Grey in 1913. And so the Paiute Trail wouldn't have been anywhere connected with that. This down here is Segi Canyon. Navajo National Monument is down here. And I'm going to talk a little later about Surprise Valley. But when Zane Grey wrote Riders of the Purple Sage, he has Surprise Valley in that book. And this is about the furthest he got on that trip. So he was writing about a fictitious place that he kind of invented down in this area. But anyway, in 1922, they continued on. They had to cross Paiute Canyon, and there were 2 known trails going across, the upper crossing and the lower crossing. So they took the upper crossing and then continued on to Navajo Mountain and crossed some rough country north of there to get to Rainbow Bridge. Another route was the northern route, went up through Old Jato and way up to the San Juan River and looped back down. They crossed Paiute Canyon at the lower crossing. That was the route that John Wetherill used when he and Louisa were living in Old Jato, and occasionally after that, but not very often. But it was an established route, and that wouldn't have been where Zane Grey wanted to go, where no white men had been before. So we'll rule those out, but we're fortunate to have also this non-fictional article about his 1922 trip. And so we can start with that and some of the photos. He talked about, on the first day, passing a formation named El Capitan, and that's that pointed formation in the photo, and it's also on the map here. It's also known as Agathla. And if you drive up north of K&T towards Monument Valley, it's very prominent. And then they got to Ostensosy Mesa, named after Mrs. Wetherill, and that's where they set up their first night's camp. So another resource we have in doing this research is taking the vintage photos out there and matching them up with the actual scenery. And sometimes we can find the exact spot that the photo was taken at. We know that's Ostensosy Mesa the background. And this is the vintage photo that I was holding. The next day, I think it's kind of cute what Zane Grey wrote. At breakfast, Wetherill thrilled me and cast RC and lone angler into a conflict of sensations by merely saying, well, 3 miles down, we hit the Paiute Trail. This is actually a little disingenuous, and maybe some of you can figure out what was going on, but Zane Grey doesn't mention the 3 women on the trip. In fact, in his non-fictional writings on these excursions up into this country, he never mentions that women were on the trip. So I wonder why he did that, and I wonder what the women were actually thinking about starting out on the Paiute Trail. This is a Google Earth image that kind of shows the country where the Paiute Trail went. And let's see here if I can get this cursor to work. So they start out from the valley up here, climbing up, and kind of work their way around. This is called Totachini Bench, and then work their way down. This was a long day's trek across, and we'll be looking at it more later, across what's called Nakai Mesa. And then eventually they got to the rim of Nakai Canyon, which you can't see, but it's behind this rim here. Dropped down, climbed up a little ways on the other side to a bench and set up their camp. After that, they would have to climb up Paiute Mesa, and you can see this knife edge going along here, sheer cliffs, and how difficult that might have been. So that was basically the Paiute Trail, and we'll see the story as he goes along. I really like this rhetoric too, and I wonder how accurate it is, or maybe it's a little overblown. Our genial guide must have called it a trail merely for courtesy, or because things must have a name. It was dim and untrodden enough to suit even me, and presently it led up over rock country that made my hair stand on end and made me wish I had stayed home. Towards noon, I recovered my nerve and something of my appreciation of wildness and beauty, but I never got back my breath. So here they are in the photo climbing up onto Totachini Bench. He talks about being able to see the monuments of Monument Valley in the background, and you can see a few of them here in this photo. So on they went over rough country, wavy, hummocky, with ridge and hills and canyons and holes, yet still bare yellow rock. And on the map, you can see they're now out on Nakai Mesa going along. And then late in the day, suddenly fronted on another chasm, a wide bit of bare earth spotted with rocks and cedars. The declivity was hair-raising to see. It was almost straight down, rough, stone-choked, and long. But they made it down and up the other side and set up camp, their second night's camp on a bench above Nakai Canyon. The next day, looking up, they had this scene to contend with. You can see a man on a horse in this photo and the scale, but Zane Grey said it was a barefaced wall that to the inexperienced eye was insurmountable, but somehow they needed to climb up that, and that was also part of this Paiute Trail. John Wetherill, though, knew how to get up it, and we have this photo taken up at the top. There are men and horses in the photo that are too small to see, but that'll give you some idea of the scale. I've wondered where this trail was because it's not on any maps and nobody I've talked to had ever heard of it. Uh, Obviously, this eastern rim of Paiute Mesa is so sheer that there aren't many trails going up it, but we actually know of three of them north of where I show this on the map. And we went to all three of them and tried to match them up with the photo, and none of them matched. So I gave the photo to a friend who studied Google Earth, and he saw a spot which he thought matched the rock formations in this photo. And we hiked out to that, and sure enough, that was it. We were very pleased to be there and maybe kind of resurrect a piece of history that had been lost. There is a trail, but it's very tumbled down, and it's probably not passable anymore. It's doubtful that too many people had been over it after Zane Grey and John Wetherell went up in 1922. So I'm considering that the end of the Paiute Trail because the country beyond that had been covered or traversed by white men before. And it was a lot more well known. So the red line on my map is what I'm calling this Paiute Trail. Zane Grey then writes about continuing on across Paiute Mesa, which was relatively flat compared to where they'd been. That's Navajo Mountain in the background, so they're kind of looking west. And then eventually they came to the edge of Paiute Mesa, the western edge, and looked down into the Paiute Canyon, which was a huge canyon, as you can see from the photos. Zane Grey describes that. A whole slope was one of boulders, the size of a house down, and the difficulty of dropping down in there. But they did, and in the bottom, there's a little orchard. He mentions a peach tree, and they met a Paiute family, and he visited with them. This is a photo of that encounter. I like what he said about the little ones. He said they impressed me as wonderfully as the upstanding red walls. This is what they had to contend with next, which is climbing out of Paiute Canyon, going west up through that rim. And it was a pretty precarious trip, too. This was same day that they'd come out of Nakai Canyon. They were continuing on out of Paiute Canyon. This is a modern photograph, and there are a few roads in here. They're just dirt roads, and a little precarious, but of course they weren't there in Zane Grey's day. But you can barely see the trail that they took zigzagging up this talus slope. And then when it got to the top, this is a sheer cliff that they had to ascend. The trail went up, kind of carved out of the rocks and pretty precarious. And I'm quite sure that's what he was writing about Marion going up and meeting Nephi right up here. Fortunately, you can drive down here now and look up at that trail, or you can park up here and go over to the top and look down, and it's quite a historic sight to see. This is what it looks like from the top. This photo was taken on Zane Grey's 1923 trip to Rainbow Bridge. We've been there and matched up the scene exactly. Some of us, Todd and Terry and me, and I think Gus and Sandra also. So this is a Google Earth view. And I've put a marker here where the rendezvous point was in the novel. Here it is on the map, this red marker. Surprisingly, Zane Grey didn't talk about climbing up out of Paiute Canyon in his non-fictional article. All he said was we rode 25 miles, and then they set up camp at the base of Navajo Mountain. I think the reason for that was this was already a known trail, and he was more interested in documenting places where he had a pioneering exploration experience. So that's the significance of that point. Also in the novel, it says it was on the rim of Paiute Canyon, so that makes it very clear that that's where he was talking about. Zane Grey continued on, of course, to Rainbow Bridge, and that goes beyond where Marion went on her trip in the novel. But I'm going to talk about that too, because it does tie into some other scenes in the novel, some of the places along that route. So continue on to Navajo Mountain, where they set up camp at a spring. And then the next day, they followed the familiar trail that Zane Grey had been over in 1913. And one of their prime spots was what Zane Grey named the Glass Mountains. Very scenic spot. You've heard us talk about that before, and some of us have been over it. Kevin also has been there. And it's very special place, I think, for all of us who have gone there. And it was for Zane Grey also. In fact, it was so special. He wrote a dedicated article about the Glass Mountains and his experience there in 1922. Then from there, they went on down kind of southwesterly and ended up in this place that Zane Grey called Surprise Valley, another very beautiful and gratifying place. They set up camp there, and that was a place where we who have been there love to camp. You can see the amazing rock formations, but this doesn't show the colors, which are spectacular. Zane Grey says, pure faced rock, pale yellow and gray and red, waved in lacy fine lines. And there again, Zane Grey wrote a dedicated article about his experiences in Surprise Valley in 1922. By the way, there's an error in this article. I just point out, this says it's the same Surprise Valley made famous in Zane Grey's world-known novel Riders of Purple Sage. It's not. When Zane Grey wrote that book, he had never been up in this area. So as I mentioned earlier, his original concept for a place named Surprise Valley was down in Sega Canyon near Navajo National Monument. So the next day they left Surprise Valley and continued on to Rainbow Bridge, and there they set up camp. Zane Grey is always enthusiastic about what he saw, both along the way and at the bridge itself. Says Nanazoshi seemed unreal. Rugged, red, stained, black streaked, notched, and cracked, seamed and scarred. It was indeed a masterpiece of nature. So this country up north of Navajo Mountain plays into the novel, and a couple of visits that Nofai took to it. The first one, after he would have been having some serious trouble with the boarding school superintendent and the missionaries at Mesa, he needed to get away from there. So he went up to the Canyon of Silent Walls, which is obviously Surprise Valley. On this aerial photo, it's this center area here going all the way down, and very extensive, but it's hard to get into. There are only two places that I know of that a horse could go through. And one is where the trail comes in, and the other is where it goes out on the way to Rainbow Bridge. So it's a secluded place, but very beautiful. So in the novel, he said Nofai's Valley resembled somewhat the shape of an octopus, and also mentions a stream of water that ran through it. Zane Grey, on his 1922 trip, in his article, Surprise Valley, also says that Surprise Valley might be compared in shape to that of an octopus. And he mentions through the body of the valley runs a clear stream of cold water. The entire pilgrimage that Nofa'i took to get to this valley or canyon uh, apparently was on the same route that Marion had taken to meet him on the Paiute Trail, and it's striking the same wording that Zane Grey used in the fictional account of Nofa'i going on this trail and what he used in his non-fictional account of his own trip in 1922. So Nofa'i spied a massive red butte with columns like a pipe organ standing out upon the desert from the main wall of the uplands. And Zane Grey, in his account, said, "We saw it, a massive red butte with columns like a pipe organ standing out in the desert far from the main wall of the uplands." He's kind of recycling wording here. And it would be interesting to know how that all evolved. I don't know that we will ever know. Uh, Here's another passage starting up the Paiute Trail, uh, up over the first red rampart and on across a flat region of rocks and washes, up again and further higher into the uplands of cedar, pinon, and sage. And that's the same wording that Zane Grey used for his own trip. Both passages mention being able to see the monuments of Monument Valley behind them. And then following along, probably on Nakai Mesa, uh, wavy and hummocky with ridges and hills, canyons and holes, yet always on bare yellow rock, and then turning a corner and losing the backward view. And Zane Grey on his own trip said, wavy, hummocky with ridges and hills and canyons and holes, yet still bare yellow rock. So I think this attests to the fidelity of Zane Grey to the geography of the country that he was writing about. Canyon of Silent Walls. Nofa'i talks about a narrow section of it, kind of like a slot canyon, and but also because it was very dramatic and scenic. Actually, the canyon itself, or the valley, is quite wide for the most part, but if you follow the stream downstream, which is going north towards Glen Canyon, it becomes kind of like a slot canyon. And so Zane Grey wrote about that. And he's talking about his 1922 trip. Next day, Wetherell took me down the main artery of this canyon system. And he's talking about these tall walls in the narrow canyon. Interestingly, we found John Wetherell's inscription down canyon with the date of April 23rd, 1922, which is obviously made on this day that he took Zane Grey down into that area. And then Nofa'i got down to Naza. This was actually a second trip he was taking into that country after he had recovered from influenza. And so Naza is Zane Grey's pseudonym for Rainbow Bridge in the novel. And this is kind of a conclusion in which it inspires Nofa'i to philosophize about the meaning of life and religion and different things in here. This strikeout, by the way, is in Zane Grey's own hand with his purple ink. He said this was a printer's error, and so he struck this out, and this is from a copy of the book that he sent to John and Louisa Wetherell. So he thought that it changed, the original wording changed the meaning of what he was trying to get across, which tells me how important it was that the novel reflected his own, what I've called moral values. And that occurs other places with some more extensive discussion by Nofa'i on what his conclusions were about the meaning of life and that country and nature. Nofa'i also talks about the beauty of Naza. he said, beauty upheld by stark stone, sublimity carved by the chisels of wind and water. And so the inspiration of being there and just the visceral response of being in such an awesome place. Zane Grey put that in the book also. And that reflected his own feelings when he went there. He used some of the same language, beauty upheld by stark stone, sublimity carved in the chisels of wind and water, soul and toil, the ages voicing the spirit of nature. So this leads me to the fifth type of nonfiction elements in Zane Grey's writing. Namely, they reflect his real love of the land. And this means a lot to me to know that the places he was writing about were places that he actually went to and that he appreciated them similarly to some of our appreciation, those of us who've had the fortune to go there. So that makes these books very special, and we can relate to them very closely and really enjoy reading somebody who feels the same way about this country that we do. I'm also very appreciative of the organizations that have preserved these amazing vintage photos from this trip that make the story truly come alive. Thank you.